Thank you for being here.
On a beautiful night. Great weather. Well, speaking of bad weather, you grew up in Canada. In
That's the way
Ottawa.
we describe it, yeah.
And you had kind of a quintessential Canadian childhood. There was a lot of hockey and skiing and fishing and canoeing. And what I think is interesting reading the book and reading about your youth and young manhood is that, and I hate to use this word, but you were kind of average. Like you loved...
Speaking to my mother, haven't you?
Like you loved sports, but you were not captain of the hockey team. You loved books, but you were not a scholar. So have I insulted you, or is this?
No, that's pretty accurate. So far, so good.
Yeah. So talk a little bit then about your childhood, because what I think was interesting is that you were average, but you were ambitious, right?
No, I wasn't particularly ambitious either. No.
You were ambitious.
No, I actually had no ambitions when I was a kid. I was a really normal kid. If you live in Canada, it's we'd look at Boston as sort of a like Florida almost compared to where I grew up. The snow would come. We had so much snow it would go up above the window ledges. It was like it could snow sometimes 7 months of the year. So skiing and hockey were passions of mine when I was a kid. But I was good. I was fine. But I wasn't the star of anything. I read everything I get my hands on, but usually it wasn't the things I was supposed to read in school. And I was just the most average kid you'd ever seen. And I thought, it should give anybody who's 16 or 17 who thinks they're fading into the background of life hope, because it's sort of, things just slowly worked out for me. And I slightly get suspicious of people who know exactly what they want to do when they're 17 years old, because I didn't know until I was 20.
But you knew, okay, I'm not gonna let you go on this.
Okay, fine.
There's this yearning in you. You're interested in glamour. You're interested in magazines.
No, I wasn't interested in glamour. I was interested in magazines, books, and New York. Okay. I loved movies, but there's a difference between daydreaming and ambition, and I was a daydreamer. I had no ambition.
So when did things then begin to change?
I went, excuse me. I was in school and in university in Ottawa, and I stopped by these offices of these young people, and there was typewriters and everything like that. And I'd loved magazines my entire life. We had subscriptions to Life and Time and Esquire and the New Yorker, and they sort of told me about the world outside Ottawa. And I always think the newspapers tell you about the day or the week that just happened, but magazines tell you about the life you're living, and they still, the ones that exist still do. And I saw these young people with typewriters, and I went in to talk to them. They were starting up a political literary magazine called the Canadian Review, and I asked if I could be of help, and they said, well, we're looking for an art director, and I can draw pretty well. And I said, well, I can draw. And they said, okay, you got the job. And if anybody's ever spent any time at little magazines, they're just festering pits of anxiety and combat. Everybody was fighting with everybody all the time. The editor, the fellow who started it, he left after about a year and a half, and I became the editor. And I spent 18 hours a day at the magazine. I had no idea what I was doing, and nor did anybody else. None of us had ever worked at a magazine before, but I loved what I was doing. I spent my classes. I made cameo appearances every quarter, and then eventually I was asked to leave the university, and I went to the university across town. And the same thing happened, and I wasn't even a college dropout. There's not even a word for it, a college discard. But it did nothing but lose money. But it was a magazine. It wasn't particularly left or particularly right. It wasn't highly intellectual or lowbrow. It was just a magazine put up by people who had never worked at a magazine before, which was painfully obvious, I think, to the readership. But it did get me a job at Time magazine in New York, and that's when, because I just dreamt of coming to New York. I didn't know, well, I grew up in Ottawa, which is the capital city, And it's a bit like Brussels. It was sort of, government buildings. Nobody creative lived there at all. The correspondent for Newsweek magazine, the Ottawa correspondent for Newsweek magazine, lived down the street from my parents, and I'd see him on the street, but it was like meeting like a famous hockey player, like Gordie Howe or something like that. I couldn't even say hello to him. I was so anxious around him. But anyway, so it got me to New York, though.
Yeah, you had to destroy a lot of poetry on the way. That seems like that was a big part of your job at the Canadian Review, was throwing poetry in the waste bin.
Well, actually, there was the Canadians in those days, maybe still, produced a bad poetry in just staggering volume. And so we'd get a stack of poetry like this. None of it rhymed. It was all gibberish. But the staff happened to love poetry. And then one time they caught me shoveling a bunch of this off into the wastebasket. And they walked out en masse. And so I had like one of their employee. My mother came in with her best friend to help with subscriptions. And subscriptions in those days were done on index cards. And anyway, so then my mother's friend, they came with my mother's friend wore Chanel into the office in this little college magazine. Slightly out of place, but I hope there are no poets. I hope I haven't offended anybody here tonight. Because I do like poetry. I just like, Robert Service and things like that.
Okay, so you mentioned time. Before we get you to New York, we have an interesting question from the audience, which is, you stumbled into this magazine. You basically walk past an open door, and it changes your life. What did magazines mean to you, this person asks? Why pursue magazines? What clicked?
A great magazine, like if you wanted to find out what life was like in the 1960s in the United States, I don't think you'd find a better source than Esquire, say. And if you wanted what life was like in the 1950s in America, I think Life magazine would do that for you. And I just think magazines had that ability to capture the way we lived then, much better than newspapers. Newspapers, this is long, when in those days, very few newspapers had feature sections. They were newspapers. They were just news. But magazines also had, starting especially in the 1960s, they allowed writers to write in sort of big narrative, sort of epic form, and they were sort of mini books. And I don't know, it just hit me.
Yeah. Okay, so the Canadian Review doesn't last, but you get accepted to a course at Sarah Lawrence, which is a 7-week or something magazine or writing course,
4 weeks.
Publishing course. Oh, 4 weeks. I didn't do my homework well enough. You get to New York, you ask everyone you can possibly find for a job.
I'd met 3 editors at this course, and I wrote to all of them, and I got interviews with all of them. I got off the plane. So in those days, you still walk down onto the tarmac. This is like 1978. And, having been at in a little magazine in Canada, I didn't have a lot of, fancy clothes. So I had a blue blazer with a crest from my parents' the sailing club, and I had a tweed jacket about this thick. And the doors open on the plane. This is in July. And I have never felt heat like that in my entire life. It was like a blast furnace. So my first appointment was about 2 hours later with Louis Lapham, who's the editor of Harper's Magazine, and he had his office on Lower Park Avenue. And by the time I dropped my bag off, by the time I got to him, I was outside his building, I was literally drenched. It was like, I don't know if you've seen broadcast news, but it was like Albert Brooks and broadcast. It was like literally squirting from me. So I stopped in at the Sheridan Russell Hotel on Park Avenue and sponge bathed myself a bit. I go to talk to Louis. He says he doesn't have anything. He said, but Foreign Affairs has a job. And I said, how much does it pay? He says, $15,000 a year. I said, I can't make it on that. And he said, well, I got an appointment. Why don't you just sit in front of the air conditioner for a little while? So I sat in front of the air conditioner for about an hour. But then I went to see Ray Cave, who's the editor of Time magazine. And he liked me, and he said, look, I think we can do something in maybe 6 months. That was their policy. They took 6 months to hire you. And I did something I've never done before. I put my hand on his arm, and I said, no, I need a job now. And he said, well, I'm not sure we can do anything. So I go back. I was staying with a friend on a 5th floor walk up on 14th Street and 8th Avenue. And as I got to the top of the stairs, the phone was ringing, and and it was his deputy, Jason McManus, and I picked up the phone. And he said, "I don't know what you did in there, Graydon, but we're prepared to offer you a job as a writer. And can you start on Monday?" And I said, I need to go home and get some stuff, but I can start the Monday after that. He said, "Okay." So I was as happy as I've ever been.
You go home, you get your BMW. What kind of BMW was it?
It was a 2002.
Yeah. One of your, I know, was that a good car in your history of cars? Okay. You come down, you get to Time, it's 78. Time this is maybe not at the apex of its sort of editorial cultural reputation, but fairly close. I mean, circulation is 4 million a year, and the list of people that are already working there is sort of astonishing, right?
So so Time was it was still could help move markets and elect presidents, and they had restocked the magazine with a bunch of young writers. So I go in there, and these are some of the writers that were there. Michiko Kakutani, who became the Pulitzer Prize-winning chief book critic of the New York Times. Maureen Dowd, who was here just recently. Frank Rich, who became the theater critic of the Times, and later a very successful producer, did Succession for HBO. Kurt Anderson, my future partner at Spy. Alessandra Standing, my future partner at Airmail. Jim Kelly, who became the editor of Time. Walter Isaacson, the biographer. Two other people who became the editors of Time, Pico Iyer. And this was just the most extraordinary group of people I'd ever met in my life. And I thought, I sort of had this misguided impression that all Americans were this smart and collected. Thankfully, they weren't. Otherwise, I wouldn't have moved on as I did.
And were you? I mean, here you are surrounded by these Harvard grads and Rhodes Scholars. Were you intimidated?
No, I wasn't intimidated. I was just impressed by them. When we all became lifelong friends, and no, I realized they were a cut above me, and but it didn't intimidate me.
Yeah. But you did decide that you needed to tweak a couple things about yourself, some of the language you used.
Well, so there's an expression. Oh God. So there's an expression in Canada that like when Canadian boys, when I was growing up, met each other, they wouldn't say hello. They'd say, "How's the boy?" But also if they said they didn't do anything, there was an expression. I'm not sure you can say this on public television, but they'd say, well, "So Graydon, what'd you do this week?" I said, "I don't know. I fucked the dog." That meant did nothing. So I'm at Time Magazine, which is a pretty buttoned-down place, and I see my friend Jim Kelly in the elevator, and I get on with him, and all the other guys, like, button-down shirts and rep ties and blue blazers. And Jim says, "Hey, Gray," he said, "what'd you do this week?" And I said, "I don't know, fuck the dog." And all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I realized how that sounded, and I could feel the chill in the elevator. Anyway, so I retired that floral Canadianism. Yeah.
It's your first editing master stroke, I would say.
Yeah.
You've talked a little bit too about the power of being an outsider and how you think that is sort of essential to your craft. And I'd like just speak about that for a moment here.
Well, growing up in Canada, half your culture, we didn't have a ton. We had like one TV station. Half your outside culture came from the United States, and half came from Britain. So you sort of got the best of both worlds. I think coming to New York, you see New York City, if that's the city you dream of, in a completely different way than the person who grew up in New York City. And I was a sponge. I mean, I didn't have a lot of friends when I first got there, so I got the AIA guide to New York, and I just walked the grids. Every weekend, I learned every major building in New York and all the side streets. And I was a student of New York. And I also, most editors who've made their names in New York came from far away. Harold Ross who started the New Yorker, came from, I think, Aspen or Denver. And Clay Felker came from Missouri. And it's just coming in, you see New York in a very special way, and you see it in a different way than the native New Yorker.
Okay, I've got a question from the audience here. Frank wants to know, you've said that magazines such as Esquire captured American life in the 60s and 70s. What form of media do you think captures American life today?
Gosh, that's interesting. Frank, I'm sorry, I'm stumped. I think Well, at TikTok in strangely small things, I can see why it's addictive, and I don't think the internet does much. I think newspapers have now sort of have much more of sort of colorful feature writing than they did back and then. Probably television.
Yeah.
Television, not movies, but television.
Yeah. Reality, scripted, both?
I've never seen a reality TV.
Never seen reality TV?
Not once.
Huh.
No. Other than what's going on in the White House right now. That's my first dose of reality TV. I don't really like it.
Speaking of that, shortly after you arrive in New York in 1983, you're still at time, you need some extra cash, and your friend Art Cooper, who's the editor of GQ, says, hey, do you want to write a profile of this guy? He's sort of a wannabe real estate developer. His name we all know. And you spent 3 weeks with Donald Trump writing this story. What was your impression of? I almost get the sense you kind of liked him.
No, he was a salesman. So he's not without his charm, and he, like an aluminum siding salesman, he'll drop your name into a sentence about every 4 sentences, and so you feel a sort of a connection.
Really,
there.
Graydon?
What? Yeah. I'm feeling something between us. And so anyway, he wasn't. He didn't like the story. It sort of it portrayed him as sort of a slightly sort of dodgy guy from the outer boroughs. His car was too long. It was maroon. He had vanity plates, which I'd really never seen before.
Do you remember what they were?
DJT, and he still got them. And I pointed out, and this is what really drove him crazy, that his hands were a little too small for his body. So anyway, he buys up all the copies in New York. He sends a staff out to buy up all the copies in New York. Cy Newhouse, who owned GQ, also owned Random House, and he sees this book, sort of this magazine, flying off the shelves in New York. He thinks this guy's a hot commodity. He gets Random House to order up a book, which becomes a couple of years later, The Art of the Deal, which leads to The Apprentice, which leads to where we are now. But then we get to Spy magazine, which I spent time at Life magazine as well, and I co-founded Spy with my partner Kurt Anderson, and we came up with epithets for people. We had like Larry Tisch at one point. He's a New York real estate developer, and he had bought CBS and was gutting it, and so we did a column on him, but we wrote in that he was a dwarf billionaire, and his PR representative was a dear friend of mine named John Scanlon, who was sort of a legend in New York at the time. And he called me up. He was just furious with me. He said, he did this a lot. He would start off by saying, Graydon, you've gone too far this time. And I said, what do you mean? He said, Larry, I'm talking about Larry Tisch. He said, first of all, he's not technically a dwarf. Now, I just happened to have a pad and pen and paper there. So I wrote down, not technically a dwarf. And so we printed a correction the next month that that a CBS factotum had called us and said that Larry was not technically a dwarf. And with Trump, anytime we mentioned his name, we called him a short-fingered vulgarian. He hated that. He threatened to sue Spy magazine. Then I come to Vanity Fair, and he's so transactional. Then all of a sudden I'm getting flattering notes about issues and things like that. He invites me to his wedding to Marla Maples. We had dinner with him once at Mar-a-Lago, but it wasn't to last. He tried to. Anyway, I thought it would be nice to just get this little feud out of the way, but he was just too easy to write about, and because he wouldn't stay out of the public eye, and once he discovered Twitter, he'd say the worst things about me. He called me grubby, sloppy, sleepy. We're part owners of a restaurant in New York. He criticized the food of the restaurants. He would criticize Vanity Fair. He said it's no longer hot. That the Oscar party we did had lost its luster. And then he said he's a major loser. Even his wife thinks so. So I checked with my wife. She didn't say major. So he tweeted about me negatively about 48 times. So I had them all blown up about this big. And I had them framed and put on my wall outside Vanity Fair. And I used to say it's the only wall he ever built. So that's my history with him.
I'm hiding my hands because I don't want any judgment. So you mentioned Spy magazine. Let's rewind and let's talk about how that came to be. So you're at Time and you're there for I think 5 years, and then you realize that you're not long-term Time material.
I wasn't the only one who realized it, but yes. I mean,
What does that
there
mean?
were
Did
others.
someone say to you?
No, they never said anything, but no, I knew.
You knew.
Yeah.
And so you got kicked over to sort of a TV Guide knockoff.
I volunteered for that,
you signed up for
that lasted 2 months, and then I came to Life magazine.
And then at Life, you start dreaming up a magazine of your own with your friend Kurt Anderson.
Right.
Okay, talk about Spy. Talk about what the thesis was behind.
Well,
Spy
it was
magazine.
happened to be the New York had come. When I came to New York had just come out of bankruptcy. There were burnt out cars everywhere, prostitutes everywhere. There was crime. The city was filthy. I mean, I loved all of that, but it sort of came out of that. And by the early 90s, 80s, all of a sudden it had transformed. And the root cause of the transformation was probably investment bankers. We hadn't had those before. And all of a sudden the money is washing into New York. You had the ladies who lunch up at Le Cirque and Le Grenouille. And a lot of characters had money and wanted to show the money in New York. And so we thought it was a good time to start a satirical magazine about New York. And we didn't want humorists, because I find most humorists aren't funny, but we wanted journalists who could get the facts, write the story, and also make it funny. So we started at night. We raised a certain amount of money and started in 1986. And it was like nobody had seen anything like it in a way. It was so astringent, and it sort of took off.
And you really rubbed people the wrong way. I mean, one of the craziest anecdotes to be in the book is that you wrote something that about Kurt Vonnegut's wife that he found to be unflattering. And he called you and he said, "If you don't have cancer already, I hope you get it." Kurt Vonnegut.
That was not one of his finest moments. We also did a story on the 10 most litigious New Yorkers, and one of them was Gore Vidal. And our phone number's in the phone book, and he must have gone, and he calls me, and he says, I don't like this list. He said, if you don't retract that I'm one of the most litigious New Yorkers, I'm going to sue you. I said, and I was about to say, you don't get the contradiction, and click, he hung up. So flash forward 10 years. I'm at Vanity Fair. And, Gore is one of the great novelists and certainly one of the great essayists in American letters, and I bring him into the magazine. And he wasn't getting along with a lot of the other contributors. At one point, he had a big spat with Dominic Dunn, and I don't like drama in the office, so we had a makeup dinner, and we sorted that out. Then he had a spat with Christopher Hitchens, and that took longer, but we managed to get that sorted out. I remember at that dinner, I said to Gore, remember when you called me when I was at Spy about threatening to sue me because we called you litigious? You didn't see the irony or contradiction in that? And he goes, no. So I said, okay, I left it at that. So we had a little spat, and later that year, we were sailing off the Amalfi Coast, and we go up to visit him at his place in Ravello, and beautiful house. I mean, right on the cliffs overlooking the sea. So he, at one point I had to use the bathroom, so I go into the bathroom, and I'm standing up and peeing, and there's a window right here, and I decided to see what the view looks like, and so I open it. The window comes right out of its casing. And I'm holding onto it by the handle, but I've also got to finish off what I was doing for the reason I came into the bathroom. So I finished that off. So I managed to get the thing. Then I hear pounding on the door because I've been in there about 3 minutes. And Gore said, "Are you okay?" So I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'll be out in a second." So I managed to take about 4 minutes to get this thing back into the casement and get it sort of settled a bit. And I used a bit of toothpaste to sort of caulk it along the bottom. And Gore's knocking on the door, and I come out, and I'm a little wet in front because of the commotion. And yeah, we never really settled things back to where they were. I think it was very. I'd been in there about 15 minutes. I don't know what he thought I was doing. I think he thought I was doing cocaine or something like that.
Are you klutzy? Because there's another story
No.
in the book about you spilling a terrible coffee spill.
Yeah, that's when I was hired. I had an interview with Sci Magazine. It was Sci Magazine, Sci Newhouse, and he got into the office very early, like at 5:30, and my meeting was with him at 6, and it was wintertime, and I had a long overcoat on, and we sat at his desk, and his desk was like an Eames desk with legs that tapered down, but everything was covered in white carpeting, except for the surface of the desk. And the office was white and spare, with Crazy Cat original cells all around, framed all around the walls. And his secretary had brought in tall glasses of iced coffee with milk. And as we had a chat, I was trying to raise money for a newspaper in New York at the time, and so we had a lovely chat for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then I got up, and as I got up, my coat hit my glass of iced coffee, and it's sort of in slow motion with the ice cubes. It just went all over his perfect white carpet. And he said something to me that I kind of hugged him for it, and I loved him my entire life after that. But he said, "That's okay, I do it all the time." And I thought, that man has manners.
Let's come back to Spy. We have a question from the audience. Someone writes in, was Spy just a magazine for that era? Could it have launched today?
Oh, yes, it could have launched today. I don't think you'd print it. I think you'd put it online, because printing a magazine and distributing it is a brutal business. But yeah, I think I would. There was periods there where I thought it could not find a place, but definitely right now. I think it's almost too hard to cover the political situation in America now, because it's just coming at you like a garden hose.
You left Spy after 5 years. What happened? Why leave?
Because small magazines are brutal on the finances, and we were very successful. But in fact, we were so successful. We planned it as a New York magazine, but then it became national, and then international. But we didn't have the money to finance the printing of extra copies and waiting for all the magazine unsold copies to get back so you could get paid for them. And it just became very difficult. We sold it to two investors, Charles Saatchi, who was then a legendary British ad man, and Johnny Pagazzi, who's a sort of international playboy. And it just sort of changed it for me. So I took over a newspaper, a sleepy Upper East Side newspaper called the New York Observer. And it was a salmon-colored broadsheet, really quite elegant, with sort of typefaces that replicated the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And I had worked out a plan for it, like a 6-month, 12-month, 18-month plan of how I would make it a must-read. And so I, at about the 9-month mark, I brought in all these writers, and it was catching on. My audience was largely the Upper East Side of New York and Greenwich Village. And so I started sending copies, complimentary copies, to friends of mine who are editors elsewhere, a lot of them in Europe. And Cy Newhouse would I didn't know this at the time, but he'd make a twice annual tour of all his properties in Europe. And they had a lot of magazines in London and Paris and Milan. And on this one trip, everywhere he went, he saw copies of the New York Observer. And so he returns to New York thinking this thing is an international hit. I mean, it wasn't. I sent them out there. It was a little hit in the Upper East Side and Greenwich Village. And he asked if I'd like to meet with him, and I said, of course I would. And so he said, I've got 2 magazines that you might be interested in. And one was the New Yorker, and one was Vanity Fair. And I almost fainted, but I gathered myself. I said, well, the trouble is at Spy, we had made religious fun of the Vanity Fair, of its sort of Baroque writing style, of its editor, of its contributors. And he said, okay, it's the New Yorker. And so I left. We were going to announce it in 2 weeks. I worked out a 6-month, 12-month, 18-month plan of what I would do. And I was not going to, I'm not a disruptor in any way, shape, or form. I thought I'd make incremental changes, and I would be, at best, a caretaker. The day of the announcement, I get a call from Anna Wintour, who says, there's been a change. It's going to be the other magazine. So Tina Brown went to the New Yorker, and I went to Vanity Fair.
You know, it's interesting to me that Donald Trump's, we can reverse engineer his presidency to Cy Newhouse observing that a lot of GQ copies sold well when in fact Trump was buying them up. We can reverse engineer your career to you just sending out the Observer.
That's so funny. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so you end up at Vanity Fair, and as you said, you've taken over from Tina Brown, who has built, I think, a pretty good foundation at that magazine. She brought in some really great talent, Nick Dunn, Annie Leibovitz. She had taken this magazine that had lost something like $100 million, and she'd made it profitable. And she had helped kind of establish this tone, which was high, it was low, it was gossip on one spread, it was something, highbrow on the next. Did you feel pressure, like, don't rock the boat, just keep this going?
Yes and no. I didn't have the trouble is had to start almost right away, and I didn't have a time to work out a plan, and so it took me 2 years before I could put together issues that I wanted rather than issues I could just cobble together. The staff was highly distrustful of me, partly because of all the things we'd said at Spy, and so it. Gradually, I like a very convivial office. I like an office where people are respectful of other people. They say please and thank you. And after 2 years, I never fired anybody. After 2 years, it all boiled down to 3 troublemakers. And basically, they had been left behind to tell the outside world what a dreadful incompetent I was. And I'd get reports back from dinner parties and stuff that they were speaking ill of me. So I got rid of these 3 people in 1 week, and then things sort of just changed. People started, all of a sudden they thought I was an alpha male, and and I'd never thought of myself that way. And but they started working together, and I built a huge, wonderful staff. And I've got 2 of my great editors here, Colin Murphy and Dana Brown. We started building up, a stable of writers, including Buzz Bissinger, who's sitting right here. And so and then for the next 23 years, it was more like the way I wanted it.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll talk about those years, but first, an audience question. Why was a peaceful, convivial office environment so important to you?
Because I got spoiled after I'd been in a poisonous office of this little magazine in Canada. Time magazine was very convivial and just very collegial. So was Life magazine, and so was the New York Observer. And maybe it's a Canadian thing, but I don't like drama. And I work better when things are calm.
Yeah. Okay. That's so weird. Okay, so you've banished the bad apples. You've hired some great writers. Talk about the stable of writers that you brought in. Talk about how you attracted the talent that you did.
Well, having Cy's checkbook certainly helped, because when we were at Spy, the first person I tried to hire was Christopher Hitchens, but we paid even less than The Nation magazine, which is really saying something, and so I couldn't get him. But he was the first person I brought on when I came to Vanity Fair. Then people like Brian Burrow and Sebastian Younger and Michael Lewis and Marie Brenner, and I worked with Jan Morris and Jessica Mitford. I mean, and it was just we had like 40 writers on contract, including Dominic Dunn and William Langevisha and Mark Bowden, and so we had, I think, one of the greatest stables of writers ever assembled. And then I think magazines are both words, and at least magazines like Vanity Fair are words and images. So half the magazine were photographs, and I think people still get a great joy out of seeing a picture that they haven't seen before. So we, in addition to Annie Leibovitz, we had Helmut Newton, we had Herb Ritz, Slim Aaron shot for me, I had Jonathan Becker, I had Mario Testino. So we had an absolute murderer's row of writers and photographers.
And you treated them all really well. And I think that, the Vanity Fair sort of expense accounts are legendary. And I think people sort of look at them askance and think, oh, that was excess. But you have an interesting argument about how that necessitated great work.
Well, the flowers would go out when writers would turn their stories in on time, or a bottle of scotch. But I wrote thank you notes to every writer and every illustrator and every photographer after every issue for 25 years, because I really appreciated their contributions. They did things that I can't do. And they're much more part of the franchise than the editor was, at least in my mind. And we could send people anywhere in the world for long periods of time. Editors were expected to fly on the Concorde when they went to Europe at Condé Nast, but it was all predicated on the magazines being profitable. So we would sell upwards of 300 pages of advertising in an issue, but it was at $100,000 a page. So there was a lot of money rolling in, and we were hugely profitable. But it was the most important thing was to keep the writers with great editors and the photographers happy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I read that at its peak, Vanity Fair was like a $200 million a year in revenue.
It was more
operation.
than that, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
You also, when you're putting your fingerprints on the magazine, you did a lot of innovating, and I want to talk about that. But first, I just have to ask you, the other thing you did was banish certain words from the pages of Vanity Fair.
My God.
There's words you dislike, A-list, let's see, abode. You don't like schlep, which, what's your beef with schlep?
It's just a cheap use of a word, and I don't like. There's a whole catalog of words that I banned. They're banned from airmail as well. But it was Vanity Fair had a certain chippy Baroque style of writing that didn't agree with me, and so the restaurants weren't restaurants; they were boîtes, and a book wasn't a book; it was a tome. And people didn't say something funny, they chortled, and I just thought it's all cheap, and I got rid of all of it.
So you changed the language, and you commissioned just one great story after the next. What were you looking for when you were assigning stories? What to you is a great piece of narrative?
We never did studies, and I just looked for something that first of all, with a monthly magazine, a lot of our competition was weekly. So if right today, I ordered up a story, it might take the writer 2 or 3 months to report it. It would take a month to edit and fact check it. It would take then you have to the printing process and shipping it around the country. So it might be 4.5, 5 months before that story hits the newsstand. So you've got to make sure that something you order up today will have currency in like September. And I was looking for stories that I think great magazine pieces have a combination of these 4 elements. They should have a narrative arc, and that's a lot of our stories had a beginning, middle, and end. The news stories would have the beginning, sometimes they'd have the middle, but we'd wait, and we were lucky enough that a lot of the times we'd have the end. So you have the full arc of the narrative. Conflict is really important in stories, that you want 2 people, 2 nations, 2 companies fighting over a single thing. You want conflict. You want access to the. You need guides into the story, either like people on the periphery or the principals themselves, and you want disclosure. That is, you want to advance the scholarship on that subject. So the stories wound up. They could run up to 20,000 words. And they were sort of the sort of interim between news stories and books, and it was finding writers who could do that, and just the ordeal of doing it, of being away from their families for long periods of time, and then sitting down and creating these wonderful narrative arcs. There was an art to that, and there aren't that many writers in the world that can do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've heard you say that you think magazines are the greatest medium for storytelling. That
I still do.
Yeah. Okay, here's an audience question. What issue or article in Vanity Fair are you most proud of?
Well, I mean, I opened my book with I took a phone call from any reader, any complaint or anything like that, and anybody with a story idea. So this lawyer from San Francisco calls me one day and says he represents the man who was Deepthroat. And which, for the young people, that was the mysterious source of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein when they were reporting their Watergate stories for the Washington Post. So I talked to him for a while, and I said, let me have somebody get back to you. So I had signed an editor at the magazine, David Frand, and he wasn't doing anything at the time. So I said, why don't you follow up with him and let's see where this goes. So he goes back and forth with him for over 6 months, and finally he comes into my office. He said, okay, we've got a name. And I said, what is it? He said, Mark Felt. And I said, this is before the internet where you could just like Google him immediately. I had no idea who he was, and nor did David, but there were problems with the story. First of all, that Mark Felt was in his 90s. He had had a stroke and he was suffering from dementia. And he'd only told a couple of family members that he in fact was Deepthroat. He was the number 2 at the FBI. And so this went on for about a year and a half. And then finally we had the story, and I wanted to keep it off the Condé Nast servers, which served other magazines like Vogue and GQ and the New Yorker. I wanted this to be kept completely secret because I knew this was the big story. So we created an office within an office with craft paper on the windows, and we kept it off the server. And this took another half year to bring to fruition. We had a photograph. And so then I get married, and my wife and I, we get married in Connecticut. We go on our honeymoon, and we're coming back from the Bahamas, and I didn't have a cell phone in those days. This is 2005, but Anna did, and so she gets a ring on her phone. We're in the airport lounge, and she picks it open. She goes, hello, and she goes, it's David Friend. I went, oh fuck. So I said, can you say it on PBS? Probably not. And I said, hey, David. And he said, I just want to remind you that we released the Deepthroat story this morning. I said, oh my God, I completely forgotten about it in all the hubbub of getting married and going on a honeymoon. And I said, if Woodward and Bernstein said anything? He said, no. Now, when we were closing this, we were only 95% sure Mark Felt was, in fact, Deepthroat. The only way to prove it would be to call Carl, who was on our masthead, but then he would have called Bob, and Bob would have gotten the Washington Post the next day. And if I called Bob, you'd have the same result. So we had to go to press and release the story without knowing that Bob and Carl had signed off on this. So they said they were going to make an announcement shortly. And what had happened was Ben Bradley had come into the office, called Bob and Carl into the office, and Len Downey, who was then the managing editor of the Post. And he said, look, they got you. You're going to have to go with it. So they made, as we were getting closer and closer to the gate, we kept moving to the back of the line, and his phone's going dead. Finally, just as we were just about to go through the ticket agent, Anna gets a call, and I pick up the phone, and I said, David, please, I hope you have some good news for me. And he said they just confirmed that it was that Mark Felt was Deepthroat. And I thought, oh my God, this is one of the happiest days on many occasions, many reasons that in my entire life. It was a really nice trip back to New York too.
And you're a nervous flyer too.
On top of all that, I'm a very nervous flyer. Yes.
So okay, that's one of them.
That's one of
your favorites. What's the one that got away?
Oh, so this is going to involve Dana Brown. Dana, Buzz, your father had been writing for me for a number of years, producing great stuff. Dana comes in and said, Buzz wants to write about his clothing obsession. I said, that doesn't sound like a story for us. And he said, no, he's like devoted to Gucci clothes. And I said, I'm not even sure. When I met Buzz was Brooks Brothers button-down shirt, rep tie, blazer. And then I gave a book party for him and LeBron James at the Monkey Bar in New York. And Buzz shows up in a black leather jacket with a mesh shirt, likes of which I've never seen before in my life. And so this was part of that whole obsession he had with Gucci and that sort of thing. I said, I don't think it's right. He should send it to GQ. He does go to GQ. He writes the story. It's so incredibly fascinating. It was just unbelievable. Anyway, that was one of my biggest regrets of going away.
That story's one of my biggest regrets too, but for a different reason.
But I think your father spent about $700,000 on Gucci clothes, and more.
Yeah.
600. Okay, so
that's 6.
So you went into public school after that. I assume. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so you shook up the magazine editorially. You also innovated in other ways, right? So you launched the Hollywood issue.
Well, I know I did it. We did it. I went to Swifty Lazar, who invented the Oscar party, and he used to do it at this restaurant Spago in Hollywood. And he invited me one year, and I sort of saw how he did it. He had the trouble is the Spago was divided in two. It had an A room and a B room, and the A room was for like the Gregory Pecks and the Jimmy Stewarts, and the B room was for lesser people, including people like me. So I watched how he sort of operated the whole thing. He dies in December, and I think this might be, I'm still underwater at Vanity Fair. I thought this might be a good thing for the magazine. So we decided to take it on, and I worried that we might fail miserably at this. And so we only had 150 people for dinner, and then 150 people after the Academy Awards to come after. And it was very successful. And then I'm having lunch with Cy Newhouse. We'd have lunch every 2 weeks. And Cy was very Socratic. He had his own way of like coming to a solution. He would basically ask questions. And he would never say, do this or don't do that. So he said, have you ever thought of like doing a Hollywood issue? And I said, no. And he said, that might be good to tie in with the Oscar party. Well, I had a sort of basic feeling then that people buy magazines for the variety, and that if you did it on one subject, you sort of lose the thread that month. So I resisted it for a couple of weeks. And then one night I was sitting in my kitchen, and I thought, wait, maybe I could do an issue. So I thought if you have a business story, a Hollywood business story, and then a conflict story, and then a historical story, and then a portfolio of actors, and a contemporary business story, I thought maybe I could pull this together. So we did the first Hollywood issue, and then that became a huge part of the franchise.
And talk about putting together those covers. I mean, those iconic multi-fold covers.
So the Hollywood issue would have 3 panels, and the first panel is the one you'd see on your coffee table or on a newsstand, and then you fold it out, and there's a second panel and a third panel. And people think there was a lot of fighting on the set when we did this, but everybody knew exactly where they were going to be before they came to the photo shoot. And Annie, Annie's slightly intimidating, so they sort of did what Annie wanted and dressed the way she wanted. And so pulling together these big group shots was an art and a challenge. At one point, I wanted to photograph all the Bond girls that had been in James Bond movies up to that point. And so we worked on this for about 4 months, and Jane Sarkin, who was the editor working on this, we got every single one but one. And I said, and it was Claudine Auger. And I remember Claudine Auger, she was in one of the Bond films, and she had been married to Spider Savage, the American skier, and had shot him. And I thought, oh, no, we've got to get Claudine Auger. And this is like mid to late 90s. And so we go back re-effort. She comes in, she says she'll come, but she wants to be flown on the Concorde from Paris. We've invested so much money in this thing and so much time. I said, okay. And she wants to stay at the Carlisle. I said, fine. So we have all the major Bond girls from all the Bond films up to that point. They're at Annie's studio. There's only one missing. And so Jane comes in my office. She said, Claudine won't leave the hotel room. I said, what are you talking about? She said she doesn't want to leave the hotel room. I said, we've got to have Claudine Auger. She goes, Auger? She said, no, this is Claudine Lange. I said, what do you mean? She said, I thought you said Claudine Lange. So this is before the internet where you could just like find out in 2 seconds. Anyway, it was another French actress who was not a Bond girl. We'd flown her across the ocean on the Concorde, put her up at the Carlisle. So I said, oh, God. So I said, let's have her check out today. We'll send her back on Air France business class. And that was the end of that. Then one year at the Oscar party, I thought it'd be a good idea to have all the actors who'd played Bond at the Oscar party. I thought people would get really excited seeing them, and you might get a great group photograph. And so invitations went out to all of them, and Sean Connery was playing golf in the Bahamas, and Roger Moore was doing something in the south of France, and we couldn't get Pierce Brosnan. Anyway, We wound up with an actor called George Lazenby. And George Lazenby was in this long-forgotten Bond film called On Her Majesty's Secret Service. He's sort of a ruggedly good-looking Austrian actor. And so we get him to the Oscar party, and nobody recognized him. I see him sitting by the bar, drinking by himself. And so I go over to him, and I thought I felt sorry for him, and I just wanted to say hi. So I go over and I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Lazenby." I said, and he just keeps staring straight ahead. I said, "I'm Graydon Carter. I'm your host." And he just stayed for a second. He went, "Fuck off." He didn't work a lot after that, and I think his off-screen manner may have something to do with it.
We have an audience question. Were there stars who were furious at being left off the cover or not admitted to the Oscar party?
Oh, if you're a movie star, you got into the Oscar party. We had you were only allowed a certain amount of people in the where the venue at any given time, and the Beverly Hills fire marshal will stand outside with a clicker. So every time somebody came in, he'd click, 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 and if you hit a limit, then they would stop people. So we developed a sort of speed line, a sort of HOV line for anybody with an Oscar. So if you came with an Oscar, you just sort of speed into the parties just so we could get them in there. And so we the job was to get as many movie stars in that one space as any place in the world. And that was the job that night. So we didn't reject anybody. But I remember one night, Sarah Marks, who was the organizer, came over to me and said, "Martin Landau has just showed up. He doesn't have an invitation, but he's in a dinner jacket." And I said, "It's Martin Landau." He said he was in the Mission Impossible TV show. He was in North by Northwest. So I said, "Let's let him in." So he comes in. And the next year he comes again. And he had just won the Oscar for Ed Wood. So I thought that was good karma.
When I was preparing for this and I was trying to just sort of live in your world and yeah, I just put myself in your shoes, and I just wanted to absorb everything I could about that era. And so after I finished your book, I read Ruth Reichel's book about her time editing Gourmet, another Condé Nast title, and she has this recollection of riding an elevator with you in that book, and she says, "The editor of Vanity Fair fascinated me. He'd co-founded Spy magazine, where he'd invented nasty nicknames for a host of people before transforming himself into a card-carrying member of the elite. I studied him with his wild mane and beautiful suit. He reminded me of a superbly self-satisfied lion." But here's the thing. I don't think you were a superbly self-satisfied lion, because I think something you talk about in the book is you had this sort of little strain of anxiety that ran through you as you edited.
Yeah, no, and also during Hollywood's golden age, say the 1930s, I mean, it was a golden age because the studios were on fire. They were producing great movies, and by the same token, the magazine's golden age was a golden age because all editors were good. Magazines were phenomenal, so the competition was feverish. And I edited a big lumbering monthly. As I say, a lot of the competition was weekly. And so you could never rest for a second. And I never felt confident. The thing is, and maybe the same is true for people like Buzz and who write books. If you write a bad one, one that's is not that critics do not like or the readers don't like, you think, "Oh my God, I've lost it. I will never get it back." If you write a great one, you think, "That's it. It'll never be this good again." And I felt that way about issues. So I was never truly happy with what I did. I mean, I was pleased. I mean, but you could never sit back and say, "Okay, that's it. It's done."
You left in 2017. Do you miss it?
No, it's been there for 25 years. You could see the storm clouds of war, and it seemed like it was a good time. My wife had gone and rented a house in France, and that we were really looking forward to. So I left, and I thought I might miss. I had a car and driver, but I didn't miss that. They invented Uber, and we live in the village, and my office is a 2.5-minute walk, so I don't even need that.
Graydon Carter, everyone. Thank you so much. This has been
Great
such
pleasure.
a tremendous conversation.
Thank you very much.